We're looking for a strong focal point in the painting on the screen. Do you see a strong focal point? And if so, what is it to you?
I see you.
Really? You see me?
Yeah.
Well,
You're the focal point.
what can I say? Well, damn. Let's do it this way. On your screen.
There you go.
There you go. All right. Anybody see a focal point? Anything jump out at them?
The tulip?
Yeah, that one in the middle, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Hello, right there.
It is kind of pulling us out. Okay, what are the things we know about creating a focal point? First of all, what do you not want to do?
Put it in the center.
Exactly. Your focal point should reside somewhere along those rule of thirds, right? So that's a little strange that it's right there in the middle of the painting. So another thing a focal point has is the greatest amount of contrast, and that's literally what draws your eye to it. And it's typically the lightest light and the darkest dark. And if you squint and look at this composition, that area totally does jump out. I think the flower just lower to the left of it complements it a little bit and maybe could be part of that focal point. But there's also a secondary focal point down where the vase and that blue banner are touching, right?
Mhm.
That's a real strong contrast, lightest light, darkest dark.
Mhm.
So your focal point also typically has, as well as having the greatest amount of contrast, it should have the brightest color. Ding, 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 ding. Yes, it does. That little thing in the middle. It should have the most detail. So those are the things that you will look for if you're trying to create a focal point. So layers of color. Do we see that? Absolutely.
Mhm.
I mean, there are so many layers of color in this painting. If you look up in the upper right-hand corner, there's the suggestion of a pink flower back behind that greenery.
Mhm.
You know, that green is kind of laid on top of that pink, which is on top of the white, and then there's some blue. And even down in the banner that's shooting across, as you start in the lower right-hand corner, she created some weird little design on there with a blue on top of the gray blue, right? So you see how she's layering color here?
Mhm.
So, okay, I think that works. What about changes in direction? Well, totally. I mean, that's what week one was all about, was that cruciform. You had that horizontal, a very strong horizontal, and a really strong vertical. So that's what I want you guys to be thinking about as we move forward, looking through your paintings from this week, okay? And if you see something that I missed talking about, please feel free to jump right in and say, hey, what about this? You missed that. Because I'm certainly not all powerful, just mostly powerful. So we had a few paintings that were brought in from our first week, which is great. I'm glad you guys did that. I'm glad you're working and moving forward on those. So I think on this first one, the artist said something about it was supposed to be an abstract, but I got lost. I'm misquoting you. So you're muted, Pauline. Why don't you unmute yourself and explain to us?
I can't see.
I'm sorry, it didn't come forward. Let me move forward.
Yep.
I've got so many little buttons here.
So I had this nice little abstract thing with green and brown, and then I said, oh, I want to make it into a little bit of a foresty thing, and then I started overworking it to death. So what's left of the abstract is the stuff in the middle.
It is.
And then everything else was like just way too overworked.
But that's okay, because what was our first style of abstract work? It was abstract realism. And this is an abstracted realistic piece. And I think in that rock in the foreground, do I see evidence of some plastic wrap there?
No, not in that one. I just was I had watched somebody on the internet how they made rocks, and I was just practicing it.
Oh, okay. I liked that. I'm going to just try and start the slideshow again so that I can get the slideshow to actually work. All right. Well, anyway, nicely done. Obviously, we have some plastic wrap happening on the right-hand side.
Yeah, I finally figured out how to get enough color in my brush with my squirrel brush.
Awesome. Great.
My quill.
So one thing you might want to consider in both of these paintings is some of the elements that we were just discussing. Let's create a focal point. How do we do that? Greatest contrast, most detail, brightest color. It's okay to put detail in, but let's try to limit our detail. I think they're very fun paintings. I like them both, and I hope you'll continue to work on them. I love the sense of reflection in here. You know, the fact that this is so much darker than most of everything else really does try to make it feel like a focal point. And, you know, whether you want to go with that or lessen that contrast there. And totally in this one on the right, you know, you're coming along with some interesting shapes. It almost could be an abstracted point setup painting. That's what I'm seeing. But I think, what piece was it? Somebody said, I think I'll come to it later. She said, I kind of saw this, so I went with it. Well, I see things all the time in my abstracts. And yes, you go with it. That's not wrong. That's good. That's fine. Just try to hold yourself back from being too literal. And I love this little abstract on the left here. It's just so soft. And I think it has this layering in the clouds. Oh, excuse me. I was trying to use my pen and I wound up turning the thing. So I really love the layering in the clouds. I think it's really fun. But think about where your focal point is. And is it in a place that works? Now, in that first piece that we looked at, that is not where you would typically see a focal point, but it certainly is a beautiful and successful painting. So, you know, that's one of those places where you feel like rules are made to be broken. So this was probably a nod back to our abstracted realism, and I really think it's fun. I think I would have to try to find something to balance out this strong dark shape. So that would be your goal, to think about that, and we'll see how you resolve it. And I'm going to show you a painting that I was working on this week, and I'm going to show you the steps that I went through to bring it to a point where I felt like it was pretty close to completion. And then we come into our Bauhaus paintings, and this one has some really nice elements of Bauhaus, and I think it was really fun to play with. You know, a good complementary pair here in the colors with the blue and the orange. And it's the mark making is really fun. Don't quit. Keep going. Establish a focal point. Change direction. You've got a little bit of a horizontal going here. You know, let's push that changing of the direction in our paintings. And what was the other thing it was supposed to have? A focal point. Oh, layered color. You could layer a little more color in here. See how that goes. Remember how we can glaze. We talked about that last week. Laying thin layers on top of dry layers. And I do think we see some wonderful evidence of glazing here. This painting on the right brings to mind the painting that I was working on this week.
Right.
Yeah, very fun, really beautiful. Oh, and this is the one where you felt like you saw a frog and so you went with it.
Yes.
I think it's great. I really do think it's great. And,
I like it.
you know, kudos to you going with your tic-tac-toe and putting Mr. Froggy right there on that intersection of those two lines. Great
Thanks.
work. And, you know, you've worked with the complementary pair of green and red a little bit, you know. And then I did mention last week that idea of mostly some and a bit, which is great. You know, there are just a bit of these linear elements. It's mostly shapes, right?
Right.
Yeah, I think they're fun. I'm glad you guys are playing. This is really Bauhaus, huh? I mean, you
Yep.
can't look at this painting and not think of the Bauhaus movement, even if you've never heard of it. It's just got that really strong element of the geometry to it. Really fun. Some linear aspects, you know, what are we going to say? Mostly yellow, some red and some blue. They might be a little evenly balanced. You might want to try to create a bit more dominance with one of your colors, but fun, great work. Nice layering, good shapes, fun, 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 fun. And this is just, a wonderful exploration, dividing the paper up with these shapes and these colors. And I definitely see the influence of Bauhaus in these. What I did when I was trying to figure this out is definitely, and I think I told you guys, Google Bauhaus. Once you've got your thing started, find some Bauhaus paintings that you really are drawn to. I'm very intrigued in this one by all of this linear work out in here. Did you do that with a tool or did you just paint them?
I did it with the edge of a flat brush.
Excellent. Really fun.
Yep.
And when we come into our intuitive painting next week, we're going to be doing some stamping like that. And did you do it the same thing in here where you created the little ladder?
Yes.
Oh, that is so fun.
Yeah.
So a lot of these shapes you created with stamping.
Yes.
Fun. And then I see them here in the bottle cap. Okay. Good work. Bravo. Definitely. Very strong shapes. I love this here. We have I'm on the wrong screen. Really great change of direction, right? So that's great. I noticed this in one of my paintings too. I feel like the paper is divided right here. And so we have two separate paintings. Now that yellow does help to cross that field. And so bravo for doing that. And I think maybe if we wanted to get a little bit of that yellow peeking out somewhere down here or some other spot, just to continue to overlap and link those. And this is also yours, right? Same
Yep.
artist. Nice
Yep.
work with taking that masking, and creating a painting around it. And nice palette. Good job with limiting. Totally seeing change in direction here. I am seeing some overlapping color. So, and I love the splatter technique because it's so strong and it's so rectilinear. And then there's just this playful splats of paint.
I tried to get values in there because I remember saying we weren't supposed to use all the same values. So originally everything was dark and then I got my eraser out.
So bravo, because in this one you were all very similar in value. And this is very much in keeping with that movement because it was to be mass produced, right? So that would be easier to do screen printing with. But good job for coming through and shading some of those values. And I love this piece.
Yeah.
I just love the mood of it and the softness of the colors. And then this one little, there's your focal point. My gosh, it's the only thing in there, that color, which is great. Yeah. Nice use of stamping, nice use of changing direction. A little bit of layering color. Because we're watercolorists and we can charge, we kind of get that effect. But you could come in over this when it's dry and even lay more bands of color and still be able to see through that transparency. So that's a great piece. I don't even remember whose it is.
Anne's, I think.
It's Anne's. Oh, very nice. Yeah. Really like it.
Very pretty. Me too.
So here on the left is my painting that I showed you last week that had the masking fluid on it, kind of in an abstracted H. And what I did was I came in and I wanted to increase the shape of the H. So I started on the left and then I hit the right and then I came out this way, right? With some darker contrasting color. And then for whatever reason, I decided to put the focal point right over there. Who knows why? It's not a good spot, but that's totally got the most contrast and more color and saturation. And then I kept going. Wow. Kind of lost and found that dark shape I had here. And I recognized that I wanted it to look more like that other one that had the boat. And I kind of had the shape of the sail. So I repeated that shape here. And I started to suggest it over there. And then finally, in the finished piece, what I decided to do, I'll just erase all of this, is I wanted to really create a bit more contrast where the boat actually was. So I added some darks back behind. You can see on the left, they're not there. And then just a little bit of a contrasting color there. And I think it's just about done, you know? So I just wanted to encourage you guys, you know, don't leave it here. Keep pushing it, keep exploring. And even though I had all these dark lines in this painting going right through the middle, you'll notice in the completed piece, many of those lines I lifted out, right? So
wow.
don't be afraid to put it in there, because you can soften it again. And I even just came in and lifted that boat on the right-hand side. You see up on the first painting, there isn't the suggestion of another sailboat. There actually isn't a suggestion of any sailboats in here. So between lifting and glazing and then defining with darker values, you can really just keep working with them. I almost never throw a painting away. This week is Expressionism. And out of the Expressionism movement, you will see Impressionism, Surrealism. They're all kind of expressionistic or part of, I believe, the greater expressionistic movement. And don't quote me on any of this. This is not a college level art history class by any means. But I think I told you guys when I was painting abstracts, I didn't know where my work fell until I read something that said, in expressionistic work, there is seldom a plan. That's me. So some of the people working in abstract expressionism would be Pollock, de Kooning, Clifford Still, right? And you can just kind of see that they're absolutely trying to be very expressive. I'm trying to move this out of my way so I can read what I wrote here to tell you guys. So abstract art that originated in New York in the 1940s and 50s, it aimed at a subjective emotional expression with a particular emphasis on the creative, spontaneous act. So if you know anything about Jason Pollock's work, right? He threw the paint. That's pretty much as spontaneous as you can get. So yeah, that would be part of the Expressionism movement. These are some contemporary abstract watercolorists working in Expressionism. Anne Zanuck, I'm really intrigued with her work. I think there's another piece of hers coming up later on. She does a lot of pieces in a circular form. So that was part of why she got included. This centerpiece, you know, look at the contrast and the overlaying colors, the simplicity and the complexity of it. And is there a focal point? Yeah, there is. But look at all the white.
Yeah.
And then the one on the right, that's watercolor, man. That's, you know, you can't do that. It's so hard to do that with other mediums. And this painting has a couple of pieces of gold leaf in it as well. But I just love the spontaneity of it and the gestural quality of that painting. This week, we're going to think about a couple of new structures, the S or Z, which is so common in paintings, especially landscapes. There's your S. Oh, look, here's another S. Or it could be a Z coming the other way. Is that how you make a Z? Yeah. Same thing. You know, the S and the Z are very, very, very common, very strong compositional structures that you can use to create a successful painting. And the other one I want you to explore a little bit this week is the circle. There's the other Anne Zanuck painting. Her paintings are really very large, like 3 and 4 feet, which is not very common in watercolor. It's hard to get that fluidity on large pieces like that. And the center one, obviously, these have very strong circular compositional elements to them. The one on the right, yeah, she's got some smaller circles interspersed, but the whole structure of it is actually kind of a circle too, because she linked it right here. I felt that fell into the compositional structure of a circle. These are loose suggestions for you, but we're gonna talk a little bit about something called a notan. You may not be familiar with them, but they're kind of a build off from what we did last week, which were our thumbnail sketches. The notan is embodied in the Eastern symbol of yin and yang. And look, it's a circle, but it consists of 2 mirrored shapes revolving around a point of equilibrium. There's the white and the black, and they are opposite and equal. There is no word in the English language that is actually comparable to notan, but it is the white and the black balancing. The word actually means dark light. And it's just about balanced interaction between opposites. And you can see how these might grow up to be paintings, right? This one on the left is definitely a still life. I see a vase, I see a flower, I see a piece of fruit. The one in the center is probably, for me, a completed piece of work. But it could be a notan study. It's basically only the two values, maybe the suggestion of a third. This one on the right is actually a notan for a painting of a little girl. And you may not believe that, but here's the painting in the center. The furthest right image I created using software called Photoshop, and I used the threshold adjustment because that's the painting put through that threshold filter. And you can totally, if you squint and look at that screen, you do see that notan. Very cool stuff. I want to remind you that a notan is not a value study. You may be familiar with value studies, and they're good things to do, but the notan is simply black and white, as simple as you can make it. I found a couple of notans online that were using the circle or the S or Z, so I pulled those up for you just to look at. And here's another painting with multiple notans. It's the same composition. And you can do this with value, but to do it with a notan is really, just really fun. They all have such a different feeling, but I think they're all stunning. That is what we're going to do next. We're going to pull out our notebooks or if you have a pad of inexpensive watercolor paper, you can take that out. And what I would like you to do is, I don't care if you've got square paper and you've got a bunch of it with you, that's great. I just made a bunch of squares and a bunch of rectangles on the side on the page of my sketchbook. Now my sketchbook is called an Aquabee Super Deluxe. It's a heavyweight drawing paper for use with wet and dry media. So this is a sketchbook that has heavy enough pages in it that I can do watercolor washes on it. If you don't have that, you could just pick up an inexpensive watercolor pad. And what I would like you to do is create some notans. We're going to spend about 5 minutes doing this. But the first thing we're going to need to do is mix up some black paint. So I'm just going to share a couple of my favorite black paint recipes with you. But go ahead and make sure that you've got your paints sprayed down. You can use black that you've purchased, although I don't ever use that. Simple black, very quick, very easy, is to take your Viridian or sap green and a little bit of violet. And if you mix those together, you'll get pretty close, pretty good to a black. Another one that I use probably more often than anything is my burnt sienna and my ultramarine blue. If I'm doing a background, like a large background, and I know that when my colors dry, they're going to push against each other and I want more of that, then I will go with like a medium red, like maybe Scarlet Lake or cadmium red medium. And to that, I will add some sap green. And red will always overpower the green. And then to that, I'll add a little of the ultramarine blue. And I just keep pushing those back and forth until I come up with something that's a nice black. But when I know my colors are going to dry and I want to have a bit more interest back in there, I do use the red, the green, and the blue to make that black. So however you choose to go about it, and again, this would be palette black. This is when you just take everything that's on your palette and you mush it together. I'm going to give you guys, I don't know, 6 or 7 minutes. Make yourself some little grids. Think about either the S. Now up here, I kind of created the S by painting around it, right? That was what I was trying to do. Here, I got way too heavy with the dark. In this one, I think I've got some pretty good balance, some harmony. And I was thinking about those circle shapes. I would love for you to just play with your brush and create some notons, trying to create a balance between the light and the dark, and thinking about either the circle or the S. What we're trying to do is we're trying to create designs using only white and black. And we want to think about our structure for this week, which is the circle or the S or Z. And so we're just making very simple, and this is certainly, it's just a warm up. Don't worry that this is going to be your assignment for the semester and you're going to have to make a masterpiece out of this. I want you to play. I want you to warm up. I love that one. That one's really cool. It probably needs more, but I'm moving on. I actually made some rectangles and some squares on my page. You know, this may become a painting, but that's not imperative this evening. I just want you to think about design and balance. Grab yourself a pretty big brush. Get yourself some nice bold shapes. You know, you can make a very fine line with a nice big brush, but with a bit of a flick of the wrist, you can make broader strokes as well. Well, that's the S, compositional. Think about moving direction, right? A variety of direction. Interesting. Just because the overall design is the circle or the S does not mean that you can't have some straight shapes as well. Is there a balance between light and dark? Is there a change in direction? Do you have a focal point? I want to encourage you guys not to throw out any of your old paintings, because I often, with abstract, just pick up a piece of paper that's laying around. This was from week 1. And I was demoing how to put those flowers in, wet into wet, and then how to use the salt, if you remember back that far. And I'm going to use this tonight for my next demo, which just is a fun little leaping off way to create a circle or start a circle painting. And what I did was I took something round and I traced it. If you've got one of those fancy little compass things that holds a pencil, you can make your circles that way too. But I created a circle on my paper, and I'm going to next mix up some colors, and I'm just going to keep these very neutral. So I'm going to work with this kind of bluish gray that I have here, and I'm going to call that my cool color. And then I'm just going to mix up some brown, and that's going to be my warm color. I'm just going to work with neutrals on top of this colored background. If you want to follow along, you can draw a circle on a piece of paper. Feel free, you know, this would have been a great one to draw a circle on. I've actually got some circles on there already, and I've got some masked out linear things happening here. I'm probably going to be playing with this one a little bit later on. If you did your plastic wrap and you haven't completed that one yet, you know, that's what I love to do. I never throw these things out. I'll pick them up, and I'll probably be doing some lifting on this also, which is one of the techniques I wanted to show you again today. But I think I'm going to start with this water technique just for fun. Grab a piece of paper, draw a circle on it, and mix up a warm and a cool neutral. A neutral is typically a color that doesn't really have a name. It's not one of the colors you would find on the color wheel. I can even dull this back just a little bit more as well, and it'll still be just a tertiary color. A beige, a gray, a brown. I'm going to paint with a very large round brush. And I'm just going to be painting for the first part of this exercise with clear water. And what I'm going to do is take my nice clean water, and I'm just going to paint along inside that circle. I'm painting the whole area with water, saturating it pretty well. And then I'm going over it again, right? Because the edges of that circle are already starting to dry just because the paper beside them is wet. You can kind of see how damp my paper is there. And I have to get a bit more in the center because that's already starting to dry too. I want to go over it a couple of times and then take either a rigger brush or a script liner, and we're going to start laying color. I'm starting at about 9 o'clock, and I'm just going to carefully paint along the edge of that circle. And I'll do a little bit, and then I'll switch to the warm. Clean the brush, lay down a little more color. And I'm going to go back over a second time so that I get more saturation in some of the areas. You can tip your paper to get some of that water to flow. I'll go back to my first color, and I'm just going to lay this wet paint along the edge of that dampened circle. See what happens if you mix your two colors together here and there. Just tap darker values into different areas along the circle. And that's it. I did not paint completely around the circle because I had those pink elements and I wanted to make it like a little bit of lost and found. So we'll see what this becomes when it grows up. You'll notice that you'll get different effects depending on how wet or how dry your paper is. And you can keep coming back and pumping in a little bit more of that color if you want to. Continue moving forward with these guys. Don't get rid of these because you'll pick this up another day and build it into something. You will, if you save them. I'm going to set this aside. It's still wet. You can kind of see that. And I wanted to talk a little bit about some lifting. And then I'm going to go ahead and get a blank piece of paper and do one of those circle things that Anne, I can't pronounce her last name, does. For today, if I was trying to create something that had a circular influence, I would very likely pick up an old painting and I would just start to lift some of what's on there to try to suggest my new feelings for it. So what I just did was I very lightly penciled in the areas that I plan to lift. And to lift, my first step is always just to take a flat, thirsty brush. So it's a flat brush loaded with just plain water. And I always try to see if I can lift the color just with water. And if it's not a very staining color, it will lift that way. And this is the least damaging to the paper. But this is a pretty big passage. I mean, if I was just trying to do something like a line, that would work really well. You can see how it's lifting. And this is something I painted last week. But if your pigments aren't staining, you can just come right back and lift. So I could maybe just pull a bunch of little circular shapes through this. But if I really wanted to pull out a larger passage, I would either do that dry lift. I think this would probably be the next least abrasive. And the way I would go about doing that would be to take a clean brush and some clean water, and I would paint with water that whole area that I want to lift. And this is a pretty big shape, so this is probably the way I'd go about it, because I wouldn't get a nice clean lift using a brush. I would always see some of the brush marks. So I painted that with water. You can see the shape that I'm trying to pull out. And I like to give it just about a minute to try to reignite those pigments. And I'm going to take an old rag that doesn't have any fabric softener in it. So I didn't put any in the washer and I didn't use a dryer sheet, right? It's just an old terry cloth towel. And I'm just going to blot up the water that I just put down. And I'm going to rub it, but not with the wet part. I'm going to take a dry section of that paper towel, or rather, old terry cloth towel. The harder I rub, the more I'm going to lift. And I can get right back down to the white of the paper. Since it didn't all lift, I would let it dry. and then come back and do that again. I wouldn't try to do it again while it was still damp. Let the paper dry and come back to it. It is kind of shredding the paper a little bit, but it's certainly not so bad that I can't come back in and paint on top of it. It didn't really abrade it too badly at all, right? The other thing you can do is use one of your level lifters or your Fritsch scrubbers. I have a medium-sized one here. And I'd probably go with this if I was trying to get a shape. This is very good for straight. And to use one of these, I'm just going to dampen it and then just scrub. Scrub and blot. And you can use one of these to scrub. Now, this is one of those times when you will really appreciate if you're working with good paper. Because if you're working with inexpensive paper, you're just going to rip a hole in it trying to do this kind of lifting that just can't take the abuse. But this is a nice little lifting technique. So what I think might be fun, guys, if you have an old painting, maybe one from last week, just pull one of those up and add some curvilinear or round shapes into it by lifting. It doesn't have to be a whole circle. It can be parts of a circle. It could be the letter S. I just kind of want you to practice lifting. Use whatever technique you feel comfortable with or you have the tools for handy. And this, by the way, is often the way I paint. I'll start a piece and I toss it to the side and I pick up the next piece and I play with that. And I often have 2 or 3 pieces that I'm kind of playing around with until I find the plan. One that's, okay, yeah, that I love. And then I'll sit there and I'll just mess about with that painting for quite a while. Always save these little things, these little exercises that you're doing. You never know what they're going to turn into. Okay, so I'm going to pull up some of these images of Anna Zanuck's work, and then we'll pick one and I'll kind of show you some of the techniques that she's using to create it. This is Anna. You see the size of that painting? It's not quite as big as some. I have seen some of hers in like installations, and they're quite large. But look at the size of that paper. I'm very impressed by the fact, but she's coming back in here, guys, and she's reworking this. These take a lot of time, especially if you're going to paint at that size. I mean, look at that. That's got to be 4 feet. There's a couple of things I want you to observe about her work. First of all, she's got a very cohesive palette, doesn't she? She's working with a lot of earth tones. She's kind of, I think, trying to suggest minerals. I thought this was kind of fun, just the size of it, right? So when I paint these things on little 8x8 pieces of paper. But I just think the scale of these is what really makes them so impressive. And they sell for thousands of dollars, by the way. But you can see she's layering here. And think about those elements of changing direction, right? I just think they're very intriguing, very fun. I think I'll try and do something like this one. How am I going to do it? What's the first thing I'm going to do? I'm going to paint that circle with water. And then I'm going to begin with my lighter values, and I'm going to build to my deeper values. If you want to do this along with me, just go ahead and sketch that out on a piece of paper, and then I'll do a little demo for you. It is a circle. It is a very soggy Cheerio. Now, the very last thing that she does is she adds these linear elements, right? That you can't do unless you do it with a permanent ink beforehand. Then you could, like an ultra-fine Sharpie or one of those even fancier art pens. This is my sketch. I'm adjusting the line here because I like this vertical coming to that horizontal. And I just felt this was a little too sloped in. So I'm just kind of bringing that back out. And if you don't know this about me and my style of painting, it's pretty loose. And when I do sketch for my own work, I just keep drawing over lines and drawing over lines until I find the line I want. And then I erase the other ones. I'm not saying that's the process that you should follow. But if you find yourself a little more messy, then it's okay. You have my permission. You could be messy. And I'm going to begin this one the same way. I'm going to paint with water. Why do we paint with water? Water buys us time with watercolor. So if the paper's wet, I'm going to have more time to explore the shapes and the colors that I want to put down. I know that as I progress, my shapes will become harder edged. I don't have to worry about having the water absolutely everywhere, but I just want to know that I've got that extra bit of time. It just gives me a little bit of confidence. I'm laying in a very thin wash of thinned out and grayed down burnt sienna. I don't really see any white in her composition at all. So I'm not worried about saving any of that white. And I feel like the process of these paintings is very meditative and kind of relaxing. Now I'm going to pick up some of that blue. I'm still working with the same colors I did this guy with. Here, what I'm doing is I'm charging. I'm laying wet color into wet color. And for the most part, they're very, very thin, very fine. And I'm starting to add a bit of color. Where these were neutrals, this is now I'm starting to move into some of that blue. Now check this out, splatter. That's going to make it push and separate. And it may give me blossoms, but it's such a light value that those blossoms aren't going to be distracting. And so we get kind of that sense of water and moving, you know, and the earth. So it's kind of fun. So what do we know about watercolor pigments? What do they do as they dry?
Lighter.
They get lighter. This is all going to be really light. And you see how I was turning and tipping my paper and it just stopped here? That's because this part of my paper was already starting to dry. That's going to leave a hard edge. I'm not going to worry about it. I don't think it's going to be a problem, but that's something you want to be aware of as you're working. If it was going to be a problem for you, you'd want to grab that pigment and move it. But I don't mind. I think it's okay to have some subtle hard edges in this little underpainting. As it's drying, I'm going to go ahead and increase the value in some of my burnt sienna shapes. And this time I'm not using the grayed down burnt sienna. I'm using the pure burnt sienna. And I'll sprinkle some of that around. I'm going to dull this brown back with a little bit of, I think I'm going to try a little green in it. I just want a little bit of a greenier brown here. And then I'm going to drop that into the circles that I already put down. So I've got this big circular motion, and then I'm going to start to create some more linear shapes. Ultramarine blue into that dulled back blue that I had earlier, so it's not too dark. And that's where she gets this little piece coming off. And I'm going to start pushing in some of this blue. And then I'm going to change direction. And I think that's all I'm going to do for the first step in. Okay, I've already started to suggest where those big dots are going to go. So when our paper is wet, watercolor pigment will go wherever the paper's wet. So it's spread out a bit too much. So now I'm waiting for the paper to dry, and I'm going to try and put some more dots in. But I noticed that a lot of her dots have a very dark center in them. I tried to put some of those in while it was still a little bit damp. Might have to come back and do it again. Interestingly enough, she also has areas of white around some of her circles, which I'm intrigued to see how you guys are going to figure that out. I'm putting the dark centers in, and I think I'll have to keep coming back. So one thing I want to caution you guys about when you're doing this is variety. They shouldn't all be the same size. They should not all be equally spaced. Just be thinking about some of that as you're building this, and understand that you're going to need to come back and play with it again and again. This is a little bit of rubbing alcohol instead of water, and I'm going to spritz that onto my paint.
Oh,
And
that
see
makes sense.
if that gives me some interesting little texture in there. Or if you don't happen to have any rubbing alcohol sitting in a spritzer bottle, just use your water and create some more technique, or rather texture. So what happened with that rubbing alcohol is it made it all granular, kind of broke it up into little cells. Kind of interesting. The reason that this blue is so granular is because that's ultramarine blue, and that's what that pigment does. Next week, we're going to be doing something called intuitive painting, and no prior experience necessary. And frankly, everything that I've been trying to cram into your little brains, I'm going to be dispelling next week. I do want you to bring some things to play with, though. I'd like you to bring, some small pieces of cardboard or little pieces of watercolor paper are fine, scraps. A cap maybe from a water bottle, something small, a piece of sponge. It can be the regular square sponge too. Why don't you bring along a straw or a coffee stirrer? Yeah, and you know what? You don't have to bring all of these things. They're just some suggestions. Ooh, this is a great tool for this painting. A little bit of, what are these things called? Pastels. This is
Pastels.
just a really cheap pastel.
Yeah.
You can make some great marks with those on your watercolor paper. You can kind of add these kind of elements to your watercolor paintings and then manipulate them with your brush. Can be kind of fun. Your assignment for this week is to create a painting in an abstract expressionistic manner, which means play a little bit. Think about your compositional structure of S, Z, or U. Just think about it. You don't have to be a slave to it. Let it impact the choices that you make as you're painting, but don't feel like it's a do or die. Because that'll just dampen all of your creative mojo. Nobody wants that. Any questions?
Did you say SC or U?
I may have, but I meant to say S, Z, or O. I look forward to working with you some more next week.